The Arctic wind roared like a living thing, its icy tendrils lashing against the frozen landscape. Snow swirled in chaotic spirals, a blinding whiteout that erased the world, devouring the sky and the earth in its relentless hunger. Dr. Elena Carter pulled her fur-lined hood tighter, her breath coming in ragged, uneven bursts. Her snowmobile had broken down miles back, leaving her stranded in the middle of the storm. She had tried to repair it, fingers trembling from the cold, but the engine had refused to start. Now she had no choice but to move forward on foot, her boots crunching through the thick snow. Her body ached from exhaustion, the weight of her backpack pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible force. She had set out on this expedition with careful planning, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The Arctic was merciless, an untamed beast that swallowed the unprepared whole. Panic clawed at her chest. Her radio was dead, her GPS useless. The base camp was at least 10 miles away, if she was even heading in the right direction. The storm had erased all landmarks, turning the world into a featureless void. She thought of Mark. Her husband had disappeared 2 years ago in these very mountains. His body never recovered. She had searched for him, scoured every possible trail, but the Arctic had swallowed him without a trace. And then there was Lily, their daughter, just 6 years old with Mark's hazel eyes and her stubborn determination. "I have to make it back," Elena whispered to herself, forcing her legs to keep moving. A gust of wind struck her like a blow, nearly knocking her off balance. Her vision blurred, dizziness creeping in. The cold was getting to her. Hypothermia. She knew the signs: numb fingers, sluggish thoughts, the overwhelming desire to lie down and sleep. She had to keep moving. And then, through the thick veil of snow, she saw it. A shadow. A wolf. It stood motionless a few yards ahead, its silver-gray fur dusted with snow, its piercing blue eyes locked onto her. Elena froze. Fear surged through her, every survival instinct screaming at her to back away. Wolves were apex predators, creatures of instinct and hunger, and she was vulnerable, alone in the storm. But the wolf did not move. It simply watched her, its breath forming delicate clouds in the freezing air. Elena's heart pounded. She had spent years studying wolves, documenting their behavior, their social structures. She had seen them in the wild before, but never like this. Never in a moment where her life depended on what happened next. The wolf turned. Slowly it padded away, disappearing into the storm. And then it stopped, waiting. Elena hesitated. Her exhausted mind fought to make sense of what was happening. Why wasn't it attacking? Why did it seem as though it wanted her to follow? A gust of wind howled past, nearly sending her to her knees. She had no choice. If she stayed here, she would die. She took a step forward, then another, and the wolf began to move. Not running, not fleeing, leading. Elena followed, her frozen fingers clutching the straps of her backpack. She didn't know where the wolf was taking her, but right now it was the only chance she had. Elena trudged through the snow, her vision blurred by the relentless storm. Every step sent a sharp ache through her legs, her muscles screaming for rest. The wind howled around her like a living thing, carrying whispers of danger, of despair. But she kept moving, because ahead of her, barely visible through the whiteout, the wolf moved with a quiet purpose. Its silver-gray fur was dusted with frost, its lean frame cutting through the storm like a shadow. It would pause every few steps, turning its head slightly as if making sure she was still there. And every time Elena faltered, the wolf would wait. Her rational mind fought against the impossibility of it. Wolves were not guides. They did not lead lost humans to safety. They were predators, instinct-driven creatures of the wild. And yet, she forced herself forward, her body sluggish, her fingers numb despite the thick gloves she wore. The cold had sunk past the layers of insulation, creeping into her bones. She knew the signs of hypothermia, knew that the exhaustion was a warning, that the sluggishness meant her body was beginning to fail. The wolf stopped again. Elena staggered toward it, gasping for breath. Her chest ached, her lungs burning from the frozen air. "Where are you taking me?" she murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind. The wolf didn't answer, of course. It only turned and continued moving. Elena followed. Minutes blurred into hours. Or maybe it was only moments. Time had lost meaning. Her body was shutting down, her limbs moving on sheer willpower alone. Then suddenly, the ground beneath her shifted. Elena stumbled, barely catching herself as the snow thinned beneath her boots. The wind still howled, but something was different. Shelter. Her bleary eyes struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. A dark shape in the storm, an opening in the rock, a cave. Elena nearly sobbed in relief. The wolf padded inside without hesitation, disappearing into the darkness. Elena followed. The moment she stepped into the cave, the silence was deafening. The wind still howled outside, but here, inside the stone walls, there was shelter. She collapsed to her knees, shaking, her body trembling violently from the cold. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she fumbled to remove her backpack. She needed warmth, needed fire. Her hands barely functioned as she pulled out her emergency supplies. Her fingers were clumsy, almost useless, as she struck the first match. It fizzled out. The second match sparked. She cupped it desperately, feeding it to the small pile of kindling she had managed to scrape together. A flicker of orange, a breath of life, and then fire. The tiny flame grew, casting trembling shadows against the cave walls. Elena slumped forward, her body racked with exhaustion. The warmth seeped into her frozen limbs, but the shaking wouldn't stop. A movement caught her eye. The wolf stood at the cave entrance, its silhouette outlined against the swirling white of the storm. Elena met its gaze, something deep and ancient passing between them. It had brought her here, saved her life. But why? The wolf took a slow step forward, then another. It moved toward the fire but stopped just outside the ring of warmth. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. Then slowly, cautiously, the wolf lay down. Not as a predator, not as a threat, but as something else entirely. Elena didn't understand it. Not yet. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone. The fire crackled softly, its warmth seeping into Elena's frozen limbs. The trembling in her hands had begun to subside, but exhaustion still weighed on her like a heavy cloak. She pulled her knees to her chest, watching the flames dance. The wolf lay at the edge of the fire's glow, its silver-gray fur blending into the shadows. Its eyes, those piercing blue eyes, remained fixed on her, unblinking and unreadable. Elena swallowed hard. She had studied wolves for years, spent countless hours documenting their behaviors, their pack dynamics. But this was something different. Wolves were cautious around humans, usually avoiding direct contact. And yet this one had led her here, had waited for her, had saved her. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind screaming through the mountains like a restless spirit. She didn't know how long it would last, but for now, she had shelter, and she wasn't alone. Elena leaned her head back against the cold stone wall, her breath coming in slow, deliberate exhales. The heat from the fire was soothing, but her exhaustion was bone deep. Her eyelids grew heavy. Sleep called to her, but the lingering fear of freezing to death kept her tethered to consciousness. She needed to stay awake, needed to ration her supplies, to figure out her next move. Then she saw it. At the far end of the cave, just beyond the fire's reach, something was half buried in the snow-covered ground. A small rectangular object, worn and weathered. Her heart stopped. She knew that shape. Elena forced her aching body to move, crawling toward it with trembling hands. As she brushed the frost away, her fingers recognized the familiar texture beneath the ice-crusted surface. Leather. A journal. Her breath hitched. She turned it over, her fingers numb but desperate. The cover was cracked, the edges frayed from exposure. And there, etched into the corner, was a name. Mark Carter. The world tilted. Elena's heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears. Number it couldn't be. Her hands shook as she opened the journal, flipping through the pages. The ink was faded in places, the edges brittle, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Mark's handwriting. Her vision blurred with tears. 2 years. 2 years of unanswered questions. 2 years of grief, of searching, of holding on to hope that had slowly eroded with time. And now, his words, written here, in this cave. The wolf let out a soft whine. Elena looked up, her breath unsteady. The animal hadn't moved, but its eyes were locked onto her. watching. She swallowed hard, then turned back to the journal, forcing herself to focus. She needed to know. Her fingers skimmed the pages, scanning the entries. Most were brief, written in hurried, uneven script. December 4th, storm caught me off guard. Lost the trail. I don't think I'll make it back. December 5th, found shelter. Wolves nearby. Not hostile. One is watching me. Elena's breath hitched. A wolf. She turned the page. December 7th, not alone. The wolf is still here. It's not afraid of me. Feels like it's protecting me. She glanced up, her gaze meeting the wolf's once more. The animal didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the journal. Mark had been here, in this very cave. Had this wolf been with him too? She flipped to the last written entry, her pulse hammering. December 10th. I was right. Something is out here. I found it. But they're watching me now. If I don't make it back, tell Elena the truth. Tell her. The writing ended abruptly. The ink smudged as if the page had been jerked away mid-sentence. Elena's stomach twisted. The truth? Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. Mark had discovered something. Something important. Something dangerous. And then, he had vanished. Her fingers clenched the leather cover, her knuckles white. What had he found? And who had been watching him? A low, guttural growl rumbled from the wolf's throat. Elena's body went rigid. The animal's ears were pinned back, its gaze fixed on the cave entrance, its muscles tensed, its fur bristling. Something was out there. Elena's blood ran cold. Slowly, carefully, she reached for the flare gun in her pack. Then, a sound. Not the wind, not the storm. Something else. A crunch of footsteps in the snow. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. She wasn't alone. And this time, whoever was out there wasn't here to save her. Elena's breath hitched as she gripped the flare gun, her fingers slick with sweat despite the biting cold. The wolf remained tense beside her, a low growl rumbling in its chest. The footsteps outside the cave stopped. A shadow flickered against the snow, barely visible through the swirling blizzard. Someone, or something, was just beyond the entrance. Elena's pulse thundered. Who would be out here in the middle of a storm like this? She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe. Then a voice. Elena. The name was barely audible over the wind, but she recognized it instantly. Dr. Richard Hayes. Shock rippled through her. Richard had been her mentor, her friend, one of the few people who had supported her after Mark's disappearance. What the hell was he doing here? Elena, I know you're in there, Richard called, his voice sharp with urgency. You need to come with me, now. The wolf let out a warning growl. Elena's grip on the flare gun tightened. Something was wrong. Richard wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't even supposed to know she was in the Arctic. How had he found her? And why did his voice carry an edge of something close to desperation? I found Mark's journal, she called back, her voice hoarse from the cold. Tell me what happened to him. A pause. Elena. Tell me, she snapped. Another silence. Then Richard sighed. It's not safe to talk here. Please, just come with me. Elena's stomach twisted. Number everything in her screamed not to trust him. She glanced at the wolf. Its gaze was locked on the cave entrance. Its body tense. Ready. Elena, Richard said, more forcefully this time. You don't understand what's at stake. Her pulse pounded. Then she heard it. Another sound beneath the wind, faint but unmistakable. The hum of an engine. Snowmobiles. More than one. A sinking feeling clawed at her gut. He wasn't alone. Elena, Richard warned. Last chance. The wolf's growl deepened. Number she wasn't going with him. Without another word, she grabbed her pack, shoved Mark's journal inside, and turned to the wolf. It didn't hesitate. The moment she moved, the wolf bolted toward the back of the cave. Elena followed, ducking through a narrow opening she hadn't noticed before. She didn't know where it led. She didn't care. She just needed to run. Elena's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the darkness, the wolf leading the way. The passage twisted and narrowed, the rock walls scraping against her thick coat. Snow and ice clung to the stone, making every step treacherous. Behind her, Voices echoed. She's moving! Find another way in! A surge of fear shot through her veins. They were coming for her. The wolf picked up speed, slipping through a narrow crevice. Elena followed, sucking in a sharp breath as she forced her body through the tight gap. The moment she emerged, the wind hit her like a hammer. She was outside. The blizzard had lessened, but the cold was still brutal, the landscape a sea of endless white. The wolf didn't stop. It took off toward the trees in the distance, dark silhouettes against the snow-covered hills. Elena didn't hesitate. She ran. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, but she kept going, following the wolf's tracks. Behind her, she heard the roar of snowmobiles. They were closing in. Panic threatened to consume her, but she shoved it down. She had to think, had to survive. Up ahead, the land sloped downward into a ravine. It was steep, almost too steep, but it was her only chance. Elena pushed forward, her boots skidding on the icy ground as she descended. The wolf bounded ahead effortlessly, barely disturbing the snow. Elena wasn't so lucky. Her foot caught on a hidden rock, and suddenly she was falling. The world tilted. She hit the ground hard, rolling through the snow, her body jarring with each impact. Pain exploded through her shoulder, but she bit back a cry. When she finally came to a stop, she was half buried in snow, gasping for air. The wolf was already at her side, nudging her urgently. "Elena!" Richard's voice rang out from above. She barely had time to move before a red flare streaked through the air, landing in the snow near her. A warning shot. They had found her. "Elena!" Richard called again. "Stop running. You don't understand." She forced herself to her feet, wincing as pain flared through her arm. "I understand just fine," she shouted back. "You lied to me." Silence, then. "I did what I had to." The words sent a chill down her spine. Richard wasn't trying to save her. He was trying to contain her. Her stomach twisted. Mark had written that someone was watching him. Had it been Richard all along? Had he been the reason Mark never made it back? Elena clenched her fists. She had trusted him, and he had betrayed her. The snowmobiles revved. They were coming down. The wolf let out a sharp bark, snapping her out of her thoughts. There was no time. She turned and ran. And this time, she wasn't stopping. Elena's legs screamed in protest as she tore through the frozen landscape, the wolf at her side. Behind her, the snowmobiles closed in, their headlights cutting through the fading storm. They were gaining on her. She couldn't outrun them. Not like this. Her mind raced. She needed to outthink them. The wolf suddenly veered left, heading toward a dense cluster of trees. Elena hesitated for half a second, then followed. The moment she entered the tree line, everything changed. The snow was deeper here, untouched by the wind. The trees shielded them from sight, their gnarled branches forming a tangled web above. It wouldn't be enough to hide her forever, but it was enough for now. She pressed against a tree, her breath shallow. The wolf crouched beside her, perfectly still. The snowmobiles slowed. "They went this way!" Elena clenched her teeth. She had to think. She had Mark's journal. She had the truth. But none of it would matter if she didn't survive. She glanced at the wolf. It had led her this far, and something told her it wasn't done yet. Elena inhaled sharply. She wasn't done either. Not yet. And if Richard thought she was just going to hand over the truth, he had no idea who he was dealing with. Elena's pulse pounded as she pressed herself against the frozen bark of an ancient pine tree. The snowmobiles had stopped just beyond the tree line, their headlights casting long, eerie shadows through the forest. The voices of Richard's men carried through the icy air, sharp and urgent. "She can't have gotten far. Search the area." Elena swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had Mark's journal. She had proof. But what good was it if she didn't make it out alive? The wolf remained crouched beside her, its piercing blue eyes locked onto her face, as if waiting for her decision. Run? Hide? Fight? The crunch of boots on snow sent a bolt of panic through her. They were close. Too close. Elena clenched her fists, forcing herself to think. She had spent years studying survival tactics, tracking predators, understanding their instincts. Now she had to become the predator. She took a slow breath, then turned to the wolf. Lead them away, she whispered. The wolf didn't hesitate. With a flick of its tail, it sprang into motion, darting through the trees. Elena followed its movement with her eyes, watching as it zigzagged through the forest, kicking up fresh snow. A perfect distraction. There, one of the men shouted. Something moved! The sound of boots crunching against ice filled the air as the searchers took the bait. Elena exhaled, pushing herself away from the tree. Now was her chance. She moved swiftly but carefully, keeping to the shadows as she worked her way deeper into the forest. The terrain sloped downward, leading to a frozen river barely visible through the trees. If she could reach the river, she could follow it to the nearest outpost. If it wasn't frozen solid, she could break the ice and use the current to lose her scent. Either way, it was her best shot. But before she could take another step, a voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Elena! She froze. Richard. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. He stood just a few yards away, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. The wind lifted the edges of his coat, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. I didn't want it to come to this, he said. Elena's grip tightened on the flare gun. Then let me go. Richard shook his head. You don't understand. This isn't just about Mark. It's bigger than him. Bigger than you. Elena's stomach twisted. How long have you been lying to me? She demanded. Richard sighed. Since the beginning. Rage flared through her. He had been part of it all along. You knew what happened to Mark. Richard hesitated. I tried to protect him. Elena's voice trembled. Then where is he? Richard's expression darkened. Gone. The word hit her like a blow. Gone. Not lost. Not missing. Gone. Something inside her cracked. Her hands shook as she lifted the flare gun. Richard took a step forward. Elena! She pulled the trigger. A blinding red flash exploded between them as the flare shot through the trees. Richard stumbled back, cursing as the light seared the darkness. Elena didn't wait. She turned and ran. Elena's lungs burned as she sprinted through the trees, her boots slipping on the frozen ground. The wolf reappeared beside her, its breath fogging in the cold air. She had seconds before Richard's men regrouped. The river. She spotted it through the thinning trees, a jagged line of ice stretching into the distance. The current was visible beneath patches of broken ice, dark and deadly. Elena skidded to a stop at the edge. She had two choices, run along the bank and risk being tracked, or go into the freezing water and hope it carried her far enough away. Neither option was ideal, but she was running out of time. The wolf let out a low growl, its ears flicking back toward the sound of approaching footsteps. Elena clenched her jaw. The river it was. She braced herself, then plunged forward. The ice cracked beneath her weight, giving way instantly. The shock of the water stole her breath, the cold slicing through her like knives. She fought the urge to gasp, knowing that inhaling the icy water would mean death. The current grabbed hold of her, dragging her downstream. Above, she heard shouts. Where is she? Find her! Elena let the water take her, praying that the river would lead her to safety. The wolf remained on the bank, watching her disappear beneath the ice. And then, it turned and ran. Elena's world was a blur of freezing water, jagged ice, and raw, numbing pain. She kicked desperately, forcing herself upward. Her head broke the surface, and she sucked in a ragged breath. The river had carried her farther than she expected. The searchers were nowhere in sight, but she wasn't safe yet. She clawed her way to the riverbank, her fingers numb as she hauled herself onto solid ground. Her body trembled violently, the cold burrowing deep into her bones. She needed warmth, shelter. Somewhere, a shadow moved ahead. The wolf. It stood at the tree line, watching her. Then, without hesitation, it turned and disappeared into the woods. Elena forced herself to her feet and followed. Each step was agony, but she pressed on, driven by sheer will. Minutes or hours passed before they reached a small, abandoned outpost. A rusted radio tower loomed overhead, its skeletal frame covered in frost. Salvation. Elena stumbled inside, collapsing near a broken wood stove. The wolf circled her, then lay down beside her, its warmth seeping into her frozen limbs. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to breathe. She wasn't safe yet, but she had survived, and she wasn't alone. Dawn broke over the Arctic, painting the sky in shades of gold and pale blue. Elena sat by the crackling fire she had managed to build, her body still aching from the night before. She held Mark's journal in her lap, the pages worn but precious. She knew what she had to do. Richard and his people had tried to silence her, but she had survived, and now she would make sure the world knew the truth. The wolf sat at the door, staring out at the frozen landscape. Its mission was complete. Elena reached out, resting a hand on its thick fur. "Thank you," she whispered. The wolf didn't move. Then slowly it stood and walked outside, disappearing into the snow. Elena watched it go, her chest tight. The storm was over, but the fight was just beginning. She would return home. She would expose the truth, and she would never forget the wolf that had saved her life. Because some bonds, no matter how wild, could never be broken.